Once it was a land unpeopled, only the sea rising and falling, shaping the humped islands, the many-fingered coast, arches breaking from the headland, old sea bottom lifted and buckling into mountains, glaciers building in the northeast shadows, plucking boulders from the headwalls, scraping and beveling out cirques, high amphitheaters, sharpening basalt into knife-blade ridges, the glaciers trundling down to carve huge basins in the lowlands, and then withdraw. Rivers bursting full-grown from the glaciers, milk-white with their burden of rock flour, capillaries into veins, veins into thundering aorta, a steady pulse of great rivers into the sea. Creatures moving, eagles turning above the islands, ravens eyeing the rivers in autumn for the run of salmon, and a cloud of gulls settling and rising over the dark channels. Only the trees, white pine and spires of noble fir in the high parks, Douglas fir and cedar hung with lichen in the wet lowlands, the great trees in their stillness, gray men in the mist, leaning from the ridges. And then people came, down the coast that would be Alaska, the Queen Charlotte's, British Columbia. They began to name the many beings and tell stories about them. They carved these stories in cedar and bone. Each clan had a crest, a being who gave it strength. Raven, it was told, could change his shape with the ease of a wave, became a spray of cedar to steal the sun and moon. They took their living simply from the shore. There is a saying in Salish, when the tide is out, the table is set. With adventure in cedar dugouts, to hunt the baleen whale, the white rorqual. Even the harpoons spoke their connection to the shore. The blade, a sharp mussel shell, wedged between barbs of elkhorn. But the cedar was their blood tree. They pounded the bark and wove hats and rain capes, baskets for their tools and food, swaddled infants in the shredded bark, and wrapped the old ones for the earth in mats of the red-veined wood. A man would die and become an otter, or a woman would give birth to a bear child. There was a constant coming and going between rocks and humans and animals. Water was always thinking, and the hand of the moon fashioning masks down by the shore.
I'll tell you quite frankly, I mean, I knew all our visionaries. And I was visionary too. We were all trying to envision where our next goddamn meal was coming from.
When they say Northwest painting, I kind of think, now wait a minute, where's the Northwest?
He wrote me once that when he was away from here, that he wanted to get back, that when the days begin to lengthen in January, there's no place in the world like Seattle for painting.
In the 30s, Seattle was a beautiful city. It was very slow-paced. It was a hick town. Thomas Beecham did make his remark about the cultural dustbin, and looking back, we didn't know what we were losing.
Wealthy Seattleites weren't the most, on the whole, most cultured in those days.
You didn't get exposed to much, you know. There weren't any big art books and all this stuff around.
There were trees on most streets, all the old buildings. Of course, you could rent a loft for $10 a month.
Now, in the early days, there was a little artist group formed called the Group of 12.
Two camps were quite clearly existed, and one was actually the New French School led by Isaacs and Patterson. That's one. And then there was a downtown school, commercial type of artist, Fred Marshall, Faulkner, Ziegler, who painted pretty pictures. And then in between was this new group with Tobey, Callahan, and Morris Graves, and those. They neither belonged to the university group nor the downtown group. They were by themselves. Boy, the art critics used to really tear them down this foreign art, this abstract thing and nonsense, and my kid could paint better. That battle went on for years and years.
There never was a center to anything here. And I've always said that about Seattle itself. I've never found, the center to it. Cornish had great prestige.
Nellie Cornish had managed to bring people from all over. Good people in the music, good people in the theater, good people in the dance. And I think that's why that Tobey got connected there the first time, because he'd already been kind of associated with these people both in New York and in other places in the world.
The first few years we knew Tobey. Sometimes we'd meet in our studio and walk down over the hill to the Chinese Quarter or the Japanese Quarter. And we'd sit by the hour, and Tobey would doodle on the paper mats or napkins or whatever. Oh, he had a dynamism, there's no question about it.
He just seemed to always have this vision with him, no matter where he was. I remember in this terrible little Paris hotel room, he painted some of the most beautiful paintings. And you couldn't believe it, No easel, nothing.
The house I remember one of the most affectionate was the house on Brooklyn across from the Safeway. That was a great place. I would hardly call it a studio. It was just a clutter.
Tobey was just incredibly knowledgeable about the history of all art.
He could say in 3 sentences what some people would take half a page to say.
He was like a sponge. He sopped up everything. I think that's why he used up people so quickly, too. It all went into his paintings, I guess.
Tobey was blessed with a high level of quick boredom. He got bored with a thing quickly if it wasn't a challenge.
Oh, I don't know. He could be the most charming man in the world, and he could also be the most obnoxious, being very rude and grumpy and throwing his weight around and making outrageous statements in a loud voice. He was very complicated, too. Of course, most people who amount to anything are.
But he was a great thinker.
His diet was day-old pastries and coffee. He was also a hypochondriac about his health. And about once a week, you'd run into Mark, and he would be certain he had cancer, when all he needed was X-Lax.
He used to do a lot of very funny things.
He certainly wasn't guarded. He was memorably tactless.
He was a great painter already.
That's really before Morris burst on the scene.
In 1931 is when I went to Broadway High School. And during the lunch hour, Morris Graves would come wandering in, and barefooted or wearing slippers, and tall, lanky, wearing a torn jacket or something like that. And even today, I'm not so sure whether he was registered there as a regular student or not. Nobody knew. He just came and went, and he had a kind of a worn-out sketchbook with him.
We first knew him when he was doing garden work next door. And everybody in the neighborhood called him the nice boy, because he was so courteous, he was so gentle, so sweet, so handsome. The first studio of his, I remember, was the one down in what was then the red light district. Those were just old muddy streets. They were unpaved streets with rickety sidewalks. And there actually were the red lamps over the doorways.
Morris was the great nature guru, He really was.
He was able to impart that. It was really the introduction to the aesthetic view, of the world, of nature, everything, of sort of the inner voices of all the sea and the meaningfulness. And it was all a sort of magic,
aesthetic magic
that he employed, really.
Morris knew this place. God, he knows this country so well. See, that Morris and Guy had a close relationship in the 30s and 40s. So they were out painting around.
We probably were the first hippies, actually, to get underway and just go out with practically no money or anything, and you survive, especially if it's summer and the weather's pleasant. Morris was just barely out of high school and had done a little traveling, and so we just had an old car and we just set out and to explore everything we could. And these were sketching tours, and they were all as serious, working out of doors. A trip to the mountains was a great, great thing.
They were just not painting, they just painted naturally. They were born painters, you know? And I think they developed their own sense of a landscape school, you know, or a painting school.
Kenneth Callahan was already painting mountains a lot, you know, and that was his great thing, too. And we liked various rich, dark landscapes like Rouault. Of course, we all had a great interest in Van Gogh, but for some reason or other, we liked the heavy moods of the mountains, and we were attracted to mood painting, and some people called it mud. And
you know, these people were isolated, like Guy, and not Tobey so much, but see, I think that's one of the things that Tobey brought to these Guy and Morris was this international work. They were pretty provincial, I think, before that time, you know.
All of these men who were slightly younger than Tobey, like Callahan and Grace, they all say, you know, they were associated with him in the early days, but in my book, they were his pupils. They learned a lot from him, but none of them want to say that anymore. Tobey really influenced everybody in this whole area. Everybody ran to him with everything. And he gave them advice, and he did help them all.
Tobey wasn't old, but he was older, and a man of immense culture, great perception. I mean, all the things that make a great painter, Tobey had. And I'm sure they recognized it. So they banded around him.
It was a loose circle, and it only existed as a circle primarily because Kenneth and Margaret Callahan formed a stable domestic center. They had a house. Margaret cooked dinners, and people were invited over.
Mark and Morris and I used to get together often, and we used to discuss religion a lot. We were all three interested in the same thing, which was a solution. Why are we here, and where are we trying to go, and what's the meaning of life, and all these things. So we discussed this a lot.
I think there is a big rhythm that flows through everything. It seems to me that in the wind and in the sea and in the dunes and in the mountains, it seems to me it goes through everything. And the important thing is that you're a part of this big universal rhythm.
So Mark was always a Baha'i, and then Morris was a kind of a mystic.
You know, you'd sit together for an evening and you'd talk a bunch of piffle 9/10 of the time. Tobey would say economics, politics, these things are transient. The cosmos is eternal. We must tune ourselves into the infinite. The 1/10 of the time you might be talking about somebody has come to town who's interested in buying a painting, and everybody's ears pricked up at the idea of selling paintings. There were a few patrons, and of course Dick Fuller was the most important one in the visual arts, simply because he fell heir to a collection, and then with enough money to build and sustain the museum.
Dr. Fuller purchased Oriental art from Japan and China, Korea, India. Of course, I'm pretty sure that the Seattle Art Museum collection contributed a lot to this awakening and curiosity of the Northwest artists.
Fuller was very nice, and he used to give us all jobs, opening boxes and hanging shows, which was a great experience. And then when you have a little off time, you know, you go and look at things in the files, and you just have a marvelous time all by yourself. Actually, if you looked at an annual in the 1930s, you saw the Graves, Tobey, Callahan, Anderson, myself. We were a minority, extremely a minority. We were considered sort of the avant-garde.
Kenneth Callahan and Tobey were still involved somewhat with social realist painting, you know. That whole Thomas Hart Benton and all, you know, it had to be real heavy boots and your lunch pail. And
that gradually gave way. The meaning of the painting became more important than the structure of the painting.
The idea that the time would come when you could make a living at painting would have seemed very remote, because I don't think anybody conceived of an end of the Depression. In the 30s, you weren't anything. If you were an artist, why, the cops watched you and thought you were a degenerate.
So in those days, there was quite a meeting and exchange of ideas among these people. Those are interesting days.
It never occurred to people to try to be nationally famous. I don't remember ever talking about those things. Graves' fame came after the gal came out from Museum of Modern Art, looked up at the stuff up at the museum and picked him to be the great God Brown.
Those early paintings, anyway, are a visual, spontaneous reaction to nature.
Striving, Morris, we're always striving, consciousness.
And symbols that have great meaning.
We all thought Morris was a mystic.
It's just a kind of primitive,
extremely sophisticated.
You know, these very strange,
poetic,
esoteric kind of a subject matter he presented to the New York scene.
It was gouache on paper.
I'm sure caught the eye of some art critics.
He was really an instant star. He had the capacity to captivate people, I mean, because his things really were imaginative in a completely different way.
And this is 1940, 41, when he was doing these birds or the snake talking to the moon.
And a totally personal vision, philosophical or spiritual dimension.
We heard that the Rockefellers became very much in love with Morris Graves' work, and that made big news. And he was only about 31 that time.
That's a pure poetic statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's very momentary. Has nothing to do with...
So physical, though, the paint more than the others. That's why I think I like it.
He's never had any schooling about lights against darks and middle tones and everything. And yet, it works there. You know, look at this.
Morris really knew these creatures. I mean, he's really observed them. He wasn't inventing them.
Even though he may have observed birds and like shorebirds and so on, he's not like a perceptual painter.
No, it's not. It's very stylized and
yeah,
individualistic. You know, I don't know what he came out of.
Morris had, at an early age, one of the most complicated things confront him, and that was overnight success. Plus, he was blessed or cursed with an enormous ability, personal magnetism, gift of theater, intellect, everything. And then when the fame came, Morris is even mentioned in a Broadway play, and well, it's wonderful. It's a success story. But on the other hand, it's not very easy to step out of it.
And one thing that Morris Graves has achieved is that he made birds a part of the iconography of painting. These birds have a character that no other painter has ever given birds. In a sense, they're portraits of Morris.
Yes, he'd have a great table outside with paper and let it rain on it, until it got just right and everything. Then, he'd come out with his paints and just start going.
That ground is very carefully worked. There are all kinds of nuances and lines and edges and things moving in there so that one object, be it a fish or a bird, is pulsating back and forth.
He always said painting was sort of transient. He just felt that they're just like something you drew in the sand and the sea came in and erased it. And he painted on materials that were really transient, but he didn't really place emphasis on permanency.
But Morris would go months without painting, and then whammo, this spontaneous burst of energy that comes forth. If he'd get, this flash of insight, it had to be, done right then. The slightest thing could could interrupt this. It was always very kind of secret. Now, in Morris's newest paintings, he said, I'm through saying anything. I don't want to say anything. I just want them to be.
He says, if I don't have any idea, I don't paint. He said, everybody's disappointed because I'm doing these little flower paintings. And he says, but they amuse me, and I don't have the strong feelings I had at other times when I was doing the paintings that, have become very famous. He's just up there sitting in his leek garden and working, and they're not big and dramatic, but they're very beautiful and they're very contemplative.
But when Morris became quite famous in New York, at the Museum of Modern Art and various places, he had employed, in some of those, he had employed some of the Tobey white writing, and particularly the very famous Blind Bird. All of that little area underneath it probably came out of Tobey's white writing, though you look at the whole thing, and it's a Morris grave, nobody else could have done it. And it's a very powerful, beautiful painting. But when Tobey was not having any credit whatsoever for the evolving of this form, which has become so as a real contribution in the way of discovery of some kind of language, a light language, that was even by a Time magazine called Luminous Spaghetti, it caused him a great deal of anguish.
That was a great controversy up here, great controversy. At the time, I could see right away, I said, well, it's not the same thing. People were just very shallow about the way they looked at them.
Art is 99 9/10% plagiarism. If you have that 0.1% of semi-original quality that you add to it, why, you're doing good. Then you're Rembrandt.
The Northwest core, as we saw it, like Graves, who liked to build houses like Guy Anderson, out in the country all the time, and Kenneth Callahan, who liked to stride on the beach. Tobey basically was a city man. He realized that the life in the city, the turmoil, the squeeze, and even in the marketplace, he could lose himself and he could be an observer within this milieu of people. Part of it, I think, had to do with he didn't just see them as people and their differences, but he saw this as a kind of movement in space.
He was so receptive to varieties of light and place that there's a painting based on the Parliament buildings in Victoria, the lights, a painting based on a clipping of cadets at West Point throwing their hats in the air. God, paintings came out of everything.
He talked about sometimes he'd carry an idea around his head for years before he'd paint it, and the painting went rather fast.
He always kept saying, oh, that's something for the eye, that's something to look at.
And I remember him saying once that when you looked at a painting, it was a little bit like going on a bus. You were going somewhere. And after having experienced various things, you were not the same. In this sense, he meant the same way about a painting. You'd move through this painting, and you covered the whole surface. And if you got stuck in one place, it was very hard for you to read that whole thing.
They were sitting there in a restaurant above Broadway one time, and the lights came on at night, looking down this wonderful crowd and everything, and looking at all these crazy signs and all these new neon lights and everything. Tobey said, I really think I can do something about that. What in the hell is the white writing? It's inherent in tempera painting, because tempera painting is an opaque water medium, works better and looks better light on dark, backwards from the usual process. Black writing turned upside down.
And the way Morris first explained white writing to us, they were like taking the summer sky or a summer meadow and all the passage of all insects or animals, if they had left their trail. This was white writing. This is what Tobey was trying to do. But it's an experience that one senses but doesn't see.
Using light as a unifying idea, that had to move through the whole thing.
It comes out of all kinds of brushing and drawing.
It was always after a spiritual expression. Tobey.
I don't think the white writing is purely a philosophical concept. I think a lot of it evolved from his use of white paint.
Basically, it came from his interest in things like Japanese calligraphy and the grass writing.
But Tobey is so broad that you try and pin him down and he's going to elude you.
He was a visionary but not a dreamer. I make it a little distinction.
In the long run, I don't think he'll be that well known for his paintings. I think he'll be more well known as an innovator. I guess that's why he became, of our Northwest artists, the most internationally known painter.
Well, first it was a In 1942, Morris was a very successful show. And then in 1944, Mark's was very successful. And then mine was 2 years later, in 1946. Well, here, spaced by 2 years, 3 artists out of one city, Seattle, where no artist had ever appeared before. That must be something in the way of a school.
The great Northwest tradition of painting in water mediums, tempera and gouache.
A brooding quality, heavy.
Asian symbols, sort of a Zen approach.
The colors were somber.
Earth colors.
Calligraphy.
Or muted used to be the favorite word.
Definitely these big, strong earth symbols in the Northwest.
The Northwest School. I don't think there ever was such a thing. There was a certain resemblance, you can say, between Mark's work and my work and Morris's work. You know, the grade color, small forms and big forms, a certain poetic kind of thing. You know, there are certain general terms you could use that applied to the three of us. And the idea of a Northwest school, a Seattle school, I think was based on the idea that there were quite a lot of these, that they weren't known yet, but they were there. During those years when Mark and Morris and I were getting this fairly widespread recognition, and you see the Northwest Annuals, you could look through there and you wouldn't find a damn thing in there outside of our own work that had the slightest resemblance to anything we did. There was no other artist who had the slightest concern with what we did.
See, what's happened is one group has come to mean the main source, and that's unfair. The picture is of Tobey dominating. Tobey did not dominate. He was an intellectually honest man, and he just did not dominate the scene.
I guess it depends upon how you define nature. If you're thinking about nature meaning more of a sort of an interior nature, like the surrealists, you know, that had been going on in New York, and certainly someone like Margaret Tomkins was very much attuned to that type of painting and getting at sort of an inner self or getting at an interior nature.
The direction that I was going in didn't have any of what was later to be identified as Northwest mysticism, and my input from other artists of the Northwest would be negative on a personal level. Negative by that I mean it didn't exist. In the 50s I'd been working in more neutral tones, large-scale, vast oil paintings, and I wanted to really push color to its limits, and so I worked with very brilliant contrasting colors using fluorescent spray, day glow colors, and color was to me a great liberation in which color can exist in its own world. So it had a great sort of power to it. It's always exciting to get into a media that has that tantalizing unknown quality. It gives it a real freshness in the beginning. But I know when you get into any change of media that you really have a heavy chore in store for you. That easy buoyancy that's typical of a beginning that makes it seem like that's really the media finally drifts down to that hardcore intensity that's a part of any creative field. My paintings have become known through exhibitions at the Whitney, the Carnegie, the Corcoran, Pennsylvania Academy, and that type of show. So I circumvented the system since the focus here was focused on Tobey Graves and Callahan. Callahan was the curator and also the reviewer for the Seattle Times. So it made a very close circle, and if you weren't working within that idiom, you're not a part of it. So again, it only reiterated the two or three that were the main interest of the museum at that time. Since Dr. Fuller, head of that institution, was dedicated to the exhibition of Chinese scrolls and sung pots. It wasn't until 1950-something that I saw my first Cézanne in Seattle. And as far as Seattle, there weren't any galleries except these little hole in the walls where the fellow went to bed and cooked his hamburgers in the next room. My husband, James Fitzgerald, was casting bronze sculpture, and it was by the lost wax method. He was the only artist in the Northwest that worked within that media. And our life was a thing of creative energy together. I really used my own spirit in my environment as a source, and I also had a fairly in-depth knowledge of the extreme challenges that have been a part of some of the top painters or sculptors from all periods.
You know, when I was young, somebody brought up to my studio 2 of these big folios just filled with etchings and drawings and gouaches of Kandinsky and Klee and Feininger and Jawlensky. And this is my first acquaintance with those artists. And I kept thinking about these things all day long, and then I couldn't get them out of my mind. And I finally realized that even though I didn't like these, that these weren't just cartoons, that these people had actually created an art form and symbolism that existed as art. And I also found out that what I really wanted to do as an artist was to create a form, a symbol that was meaningful as art. That was what I really wanted to be able to do. So I did a lot of things that were symbolic things that were perhaps a little bit influenced by Michelangelo and some of those Renaissance people, but they never satisfied me. And when I did finally evolve a way of doing them that pleased me, then I would exhibit them. The real change in you as a person takes place when the motivation changes, and not necessarily in the realization. I'd lie in bed at night and I'd paint it in my mind, and I'd have the whole thing all figured out already. And I was just making an illustration of what I'd already painted. And so I quit that completely then. And that way, the thing would evolve in the process of painting and would come out as a painting and not as an illustration. Something that interests me in many of my paintings in the last few years is the wind currents and wave currents, movements of the sea. This constant repetition and repeating and return. I don't try to paint those things, But because I feel the interrelationship in these things, I think perhaps it comes out in paintings. And because I look at some of my older paintings that I've done 20, 30 years ago, and it seems to me I see quite a lot of ideas in there that I have had in the past. Many people feel that an artist should develop a style, and if his style is abstract, all his paintings and drawings and everything should be abstract, because that's his style. Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's no one that has developed their eyes or changed their eyes to the point every time they look at a woman or a man, they see this as a man or as a woman. Well, what they do with it when they translate that into art is something different. And I see no reason why an artist shouldn't be very interested in the specific detail of what an insect looks like. And to say that he should no longer be interested in the appearance of the insects because he only does abstractions now, I think it's ridiculous. You know, you go on and on, it's just nonsense to talk about if you do this, you're dealing with realism, and if you do that, you're dealing with abstraction. If they're both alive, you've made art. Mm-hmm. And that's the only thing that artists should be concerned with.
Well, in the Western European concept of painting, they talk about landscape. And then they make painting in the studio of bottles and fruits and, things like that. They call it still life, nature mort, dead nature, see? Well, this is just the opposite from the Oriental concept. When there's no such a word, a dead nature in the Orient. Everything is alive, even a piece of rock, it's alive, has a life. See, there's no such thing as a dead nature. So when we paint trees, clouds, mountains, or birds, animals, we always sketch it alive. To me, water is the most fascinating of all the elements we have. We have a mountain range, 200 miles on both sides of us, and then just numerous rivers and creeks and lakes. And then the mountains have snow all year round, all that abundance of clear running water, and see the rocks, because that was always my inspiration, always has been, for my sculpture and my paintings.
The Northwest is wet, no doubt about it. It tends to be sort of dark and gloomy and gray. And there's one thing you can't deny, it's close to the oil, comparatively. And the Japan current brings all these Zen influences.
I used to hate that people say that I'm a Japanese style painter, because I never intend to that way. I just want to be just another painter. But of course it doesn't matter what they say to me now, it doesn't bother me. But older I get, I want to know more about the culture of my ancestors. I always wanted to paint something very quiet. I did oil painting for 30 years before I went in this collage. But somehow I cannot express myself in oil. Ever since I was a child, brush and rice paper, we have to do it, you know. But I wanted to paint on rice paper. I never did it before. Interesting thing, the Japanese did a collage in 12th century. You know, in the Western, it started early 19th century, you know. Museum director of Japan, National Museum director, said, I'm the first one I did this type of collage, and of course quite a number of people doing now. When you really love nature, well, nature will come to you. You really seek for beautiful nature, nature will come to you. Can't help, you have to paint. Just like when you sing, you know, you have to sing. I'm influenced by Tobey philosophically, you know. I think I learned so much Oriental philosophy from him. Him and Mr. Takizaki, who's our friend, you know. We had a good time together. But I learned many things from Tobey. He taught me how to see things. One day he just stopped walking and looking at the ground with a little water bottle there. I says, Mark, what are you looking? He says, look at that beautiful thing. The little oil floating on the water and beautiful weathered billboards. He was a very important man to me. And one day he was doing sort of sumi painting, black and white. So I said, Mark, if you want to do sumi painting, I give you real sumi and rice paper and brush. He says, okay. So I give him sumi and the brush identical to this. It's a beautiful brush. And he likes so much. You know, he touches things when he likes things. Oh, it's nice. Then he went to work next day. And he worked all summer. He made 90 sumi paintings in one summer. Yes, he's just splashing away and his shirt is all spotted with sumi, you know. I wish I have that shirt. It's beautiful.
1957, Tobey was really hot on the sumi painting. Very few people can handle the sumi ink like Tobey did. It was a great period for him. And we used to have a little gathering right here in this room. And after dinner, we put out paper and ink, and Horiuchi was here, and Matsudaira was here, and myself, and sometime some other friends. And Tobey would just do many, many sumi, one after another. He gets so excited, you know. And this is one of them. And this is, I think, one of the boldest and most dashing ones, because I remember he did this with one stroke. He had a big brush just loaded with sumi ink, and then this rice paper, and I don't know which way he started. I think he started over here, and then he went like that. It was finished in, maybe 3 seconds, 5 seconds. But it's one of his best sumi. I think it was the late 30s when I met Helmi in Mark Tobey's studio.
Oddly enough, looked at slightly askew, standing in a corner of the room, it shimmers like a Tobey from that period. Looked at head on, it's a Helmi with lots of Tobey heads.
We all accepted Helmi. We knew she was a little bit different or odd, but we all accepted her, and we liked her attitude and what she was doing.
She was this warm creature who would just throw her arms around you, you know, and hug you when she saw you. She had this spontaneous affection for people.
Oh yeah, she had a clothesline and a little tin can, and the prints were on the clothesline University Way, and the sign said 50 cents each, and you took what you wanted, put the money in a can, and she'd come down now and then and empty the can in her blouse, and then on the weekend she'd go to the public market, set up the stall, and God, she was one of the few artists making a living from his or her own work. She got around and sketched every place that she was. Yeah, sleeping bags slept on the ground, on the Indian villages, banged all over the place.
The Indians all used natural colors that they got from stones and things, and so they didn't have much color. They used whatever they could get hold of.
Gosh, she was such a talented person. It was extraordinary. She did have a fantasy about Tobey, undoubtedly. It had become such a fixation with her.
She probably had times when she became very confused or lost her memory, which gave people around her the impression that she was, you know, insane or something, which I don't think she was. And she was put in a sanitarium for 20 years. According to the medical records, she had inadequate personality.
Well, I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and feed the cats, and then we have breakfast, and then I paint, and then we have lunch, and then I paint again. Well, mostly I paint.
I know that the term mystic has been terribly used and corned up over the years and everything, but it doesn't change the aspect if you're talking about the mystical insight of things and the magical insight of things. You've got to call it something. here at the country a number of years ago and left Seattle after 8 or 9 years working there. And I really was really weary and tired. And you just say, I've got to go away, or I'm just going to go to pieces, which was really happening. Of course, then you don't have any means or anything much, but you learn how to live very simply and get concentrated then in your painting. There's something about that long vista that we have out here that I've always liked very much, just a long stretch of just pasture and sky. So this is what I was trying to do. I was trying to do a thing of a wet winter day and just one little animal feeding way out on a long pasture.
We were out there walking along the dike one day, and here's Guy down in that little pea patch house. And it was just it was a beautiful little spot. He was in there painting away, whistling and singing. You could always go out there, and he was always this little whistling and going on out there.
This is not a very joyous, always sunny palette, And I think this is partly because I love the early Spanish school, and I loved also the early Japanese prints, and they're dealing with lots of black. I was strongly influenced by the higher, earlier forms of Alaskan and Canadian coast Indians. Northwest Indian in the basic design is related to early Han of the Chinese. It is also related in the basic design to Mayan and Aztec. A lot of it evolved out of nature forms, I'm sure of this. You look around in the world and all through the world of nature and the study of insect forms and rocks and petrified wood, and these nature forms, I'm sure, took hold in all of those cultures, and it may have, there's a possibility that it just evolved. If you're doing something and it has been successful, the person who's observing it doesn't have to take everything to it. There should be enough power that comes out of it that if the person is open and at all sensitive, it will speak to them. Otherwise, it probably doesn't have much power in the creative sense. It didn't bother me that I wasn't a top banana, really. As a matter of fact, I had a good chance to look at people becoming celebrities. As soon as people get famous, they're kind of possessed by the world. And then all of a sudden, they have to kind of measure up to all kinds of things that not even they like very well. As Tobey said, after he had become very well known, I just don't have any fun anymore, he says. There's always something you have to do, somebody wants you. You are expected to measure up to these standards, and people want to see you.
God almighty, how do you paint a picture with your head filled with all this, Northwest master?
He said, you go back to Seattle and you try and think like a mystic and act like a mystic and paint like a mystic. He says, then's when you have to worry.
The nonsense people talk about art should be a criminal offense. When our earlier friends became kind of famous and that sort of thing, their interests were in other places, and no longer did they feel at home in the place that they were so well known. We were no longer all of us friendly. We weren't exchanging ideas, and we had covered all the ground that was so rich and so much of a contribution to one another earlier. That didn't exist anymore.
I have a feeling that this rather strong movement or direction, which we collectively called Northwest art or painting, has certainly diminished a lot. I think there are very few people, if any, who really picked it up and carried it on today.
But one great thing about today and in an eclectic culture that we have is that one isn't just stuck with one kind of thing. A young person can choose in what direction they want to go. If the person has any standards, they don't come out there in just the New York or Paris standards, but something within the person's self. It should be a long, slow process. And I think this applies to painting, and I think it goes right through maybe kind of some unconscious thing we have that comes through in the structure of the universe. You know, we just kind of have to kind of, I'd like to think about that. All painting